Sometimes life takes everything you've worked for in a single moment, leaving you with nothing but the choice to give up or keep going. Sarah McKinnon learned this truth the hard way when a Montana blizzard destroyed her cabin and left her stranded in the freezing wilderness. The winter of 1887 was brutal, and Sarah faced death alone in the snow. Her small homestead had crumbled under the storm's weight. With frostbite setting in and no shelter for miles, she prepared to surrender to the cold. Then Ezra Coleman appeared through the white. He'd lived alone in these mountains for 15 years, avoiding people and the memories that haunted him. But something about Sarah's quiet strength made him offer what he'd never given another soul, his help. Two strangers, both running from their past, found themselves sharing one small cabin as the worst storm in decades raged outside. What neither expected was how saving each other would change everything they thought they knew about trust, hope, and second chances. What happens when two broken people discover they're exactly what the other needs to heal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before the storm that would change everything, Sarah McKinnon stood in her modest cabin doorway, watching the morning sun paint the Montana peaks in shades of gold and rose. The sight never failed to stir something deep in her chest, a mixture of awe and loneliness that had become her constant companion since Thomas died 2 winters past. Her hands, roughened by 2 years of work that should have belonged to a man, gripped the doorframe as she surveyed her small kingdom. 20 acres of stubborn mountain soil, a vegetable garden that fought her every season, and a handful of chickens that somehow managed to lay eggs despite the harsh conditions. It wasn't much, but it was hers. More importantly, it was theirs. The life she and Thomas had dreamed of building together in these unforgiving but beautiful mountains. "You'd be proud of me, wouldn't you, Thomas?" she whispered to the crisp morning air, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry atmosphere. "Still here? Still fighting?" The words carried no response, save the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, but Sarah had long since stopped expecting answers from the dead. What mattered was that she could still hear his voice in her memory, still feel the warmth of his encouragement when the mountain winters threatened to break her spirit. Inside the cabin, the hand-carved chess set that Thomas had made during their first winter together sat on the small table near the window. She'd never learned to play properly. Thomas had tried to teach her, but she'd been more interested in watching his hands move the pieces, marveling at the patience and precision he brought to everything he touched. Now the carved wooden figures stood frozen in the middle of a game they'd started but never finished. The day before the fever took him, Sarah moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to depend entirely on herself. Feed the chickens, milk the goat, check the small root cellar where her carefully preserved vegetables would carry her through another winter. Each task was performed with deliberate care. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, could mean the difference between survival and disaster in this remote corner of the territory. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down the mountain, a grizzled prospector named Murphy, who stopped by twice a year to check on the widow woman, as he called her with gruff kindness. The nearest town, Copper Falls, required a 2-day journey on horseback through treacherous mountain passes that became impassable once the heavy snows began. Sarah had made the trip exactly once since Thomas's death, to buy supplies and collect the handful of letters that occasionally found their way to her. Through the territorial mail system, most folks in Copper Falls thought she was foolish for staying alone in the high country. The women clucked their tongues and shook their heads, whispering about how grief had addled her common sense. The men were more direct in their judgment, suggesting with varying degrees of politeness that a woman alone in such a place was either asking for trouble or simply waiting to die. What they didn't understand, what no one seemed to understand, was that leaving would mean abandoning the only place where Thomas still felt real to her. In town, surrounded by the noise and bustle of other people's lives, his memory became thin and insubstantial. But here, in the cabin he'd built with his own hands, she could still feel his presence in every carefully fitted log, every precisely mortised joint. The afternoon brought the first signs of the approaching storm. Sarah had learned to read the mountain weather with the same attention she'd once paid to her husband's moods. The way the wind shifted from the northwest, carrying the scent of snow and ice from the high peaks. The peculiar quality of the light that seemed to flatten and dim even as the sun remained visible. The behavior of the animals, the way the chickens huddled closer together, the goats' restless bleating, the absence of bird song from the surrounding pines. By evening, she was certain, this wouldn't be an ordinary storm. The pressure in her bones told her so, the deep, aching sensation she'd learned to trust more than any barometer. Thomas had felt it too, claiming he could predict the weather 3 days out just by the way his old cavalry wound throbbed. Sarah spent the evening reinforcing the cabin as best she could. She dragged extra firewood inside, stacking it against the far wall until there was barely room to move around the small space. She secured the shutters with additional latches Thomas had installed their second year, designed to hold against wind that could knock a man off his feet. She checked and double-checked her food supplies, calculating how long her stores would last if the storm kept her trapped for weeks rather than days. The photograph of Thomas, worn soft at the edges from handling, sat propped against the wooden cross he'd carved for their first Christmas together. In the image, captured by a traveling photographer who'd passed through Copper Falls the summer they were married, Thomas stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, his face serious, but his eyes warm with the quiet happiness that had defined their brief life together. "If this storm is as bad as I think it's going to be," she told his image, "I might be seeing you sooner than expected." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they weren't true. She'd fought too hard for too long to give up now, storm or no storm. Whatever was coming, she would face it the same way she'd faced every challenge since Thomas died, with stubborn determination and the quiet strength that had surprised everyone, including herself. 20 miles up the mountain, in a cabin twice the size of Sarah's, but containing only one occupant, Ezra Coleman was making similar preparations for the approaching storm. Unlike Sarah, however, Ezra had no photograph to comfort him, no gentle memories to sustain him through the long winter nights. The reminders of his past were far more painful. Surgical instruments he hadn't touched in 15 years. Medical texts whose pages he knew by heart, and most painful of all, a child's wooden toy horse that sat on the mantelpiece like an accusation. Ezra had come to these mountains seeking not the comfort of familiar places, but the harsh mercy of complete isolation. Where Sarah stayed to remain close to love, Ezra had retreated to escape the weight of it. Where she fought to preserve memories, he struggled daily to forget them. His cabin reflected this difference. Built with the same skill Thomas had brought to his work, it was nonetheless a fortress rather than a home. Heavy shutters that could turn the building into a windowless bunker. Food stores that could sustain him for months without resupply. Weapons maintained with military precision, though the only enemies he expected to face were the wolves and bears that occasionally tested his boundaries. The chess set on his table was carved from mountain oak, each piece shaped with the precision of a man who had once wielded a scalpel for 12 hours straight to save a life. Unlike Sarah's frozen game, however, Ezra's board held an active match, a contest he played against himself, switching sides after each move in a ritual that had consumed thousands of solitary evenings. As the wind began to howl through the surrounding pines, carrying with it the promise of the storm to come, neither Sarah nor Ezra could have imagined that their separate paths through grief and isolation were about to intersect. Neither could have foreseen that the very storm that threatened to destroy everything they'd built would instead become the catalyst for something neither had dared to hope for again. The last thing Sarah did before banking the fire and settling into her narrow bed was to slip the worn photograph of Thomas inside her coat pocket close to her heart. She'd carried it with her during every difficult moment of the past 2 years. and she wouldn't face whatever was coming without his image near, 20 miles away. Ezra made his own preparations for sleep, checking the locks on his shutters and the supply of firewood by his hearth. But unlike Sarah, he made no gesture toward comfort or companionship. The toy horse remained on its shelf, gathering dust, while the man who had once been the most respected physician in 3 counties settled into another night of dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would bring the storm that would change everything. But tonight, they were still strangers, still alone, still carrying their separate burdens through the long mountain darkness. The storm struck with a violence that defied Sarah's worst expectations. What had begun as steady snowfall the previous evening transformed overnight into a howling beast that seemed determined to tear her small world apart. By dawn, the wind was screaming through the pines with such force that the entire cabin shook on its foundation, and snow drove sideways past the windows in sheets so thick she couldn't see her own woodpile 10 feet away. Sarah huddled near the fire, wrapped in every blanket she owned, listening to the increasingly ominous sounds from above. The roof beams groaned and creaked under a load of snow that grew heavier by the hour. Thomas had built the cabin strong, but even his careful craftsmanship had limits. The first real warning came with a sharp crack from somewhere overhead, followed by a sound like thunder as something heavy shifted on the roof. Sarah looked up at the ceiling, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw a thin line of white powder drifting down from between 2 logs. "Hold together," she whispered, pressing her hand against the photograph in her coat pocket. "Just hold together." But the mountain had other plans. The collapse began gradually, almost gently. A small section of roof near the back corner sagged inward as the weight of accumulated snow finally overwhelmed the supporting beams. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as the carefully chinked logs began to separate, allowing the storm to pour into her sanctuary. Within minutes, what had been a small leak became a catastrophic failure. The entire back third of the roof gave way, with a sound like 100 trees falling at once. And suddenly, Sarah's warm refuge became a death trap filled with swirling snow and splintered wood. She grabbed what she could, her heaviest coat, a wool blanket, the small bag of dried meat from her emergency supplies, and fought her way toward the door through debris and driving snow. The photograph never left her pocket. Even in her panic, she kept one hand pressed against it, as if Thomas's image could somehow anchor her to life. Outside, the storm was a living thing, a white monster that tried to tear the breath from her lungs and the sight from her eyes. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving through her clothes and into her bones with shocking speed. She could feel her body temperature dropping almost immediately, her fingers and toes beginning to tingle with the first warnings of frostbite. The wreckage of her cabin offered no shelter. What remained standing was already filling with snow, and the collapsed section was completely impassable. Sarah turned her back to the wind and tried to think through the growing fog of cold and fear that clouded her mind. The nearest shelter was Murphy's cabin, 15 miles down the mountain, impossible to reach in these conditions, even if she'd had snowshoes and perfect visibility. There was nowhere to go, no help coming, no way to survive the night without protection from the wind and cold. This was how she would die then. Not gradually, weakened by illness or age, but quickly, claimed by the same mountains that had given her the last 2 years of purpose. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fought so hard to stay close to Thomas's memory that she was about to join him in death. But as the cold crept deeper into her body and her legs began to feel unsteady beneath her, Sarah discovered something she hadn't known about herself. When faced with the absolute certainty of death, she didn't feel peaceful acceptance or resigned surrender. Instead, she felt a burning anger that started in her chest and spread through her limbs like liquid fire. She had survived 2 years alone in these mountains. She had learned to split wood and patch roofs and deliver breech calves and a dozen other skills that most women never needed to master. She had endured loneliness that sometimes felt like a physical pain and grief that had nearly broken Her mind, during those first terrible months after Thomas's death, she would not die because a storm knocked down some logs and snow. Sarah turned into the wind and began to walk uphill, toward the high country, where she'd never ventured, but where she knew there were caves and overhangs that might offer shelter. Each step was a battle against the driving snow and her own failing strength. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant dying. The photograph in her pocket seemed to radiate warmth against her chest, and she could almost hear Thomas's voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "That's my girl. Keep fighting." She had no idea how long she struggled through the storm. Time became meaningless when measured only by the effort of breathing and the need to keep moving forward. Her world shrank to the next step, the next breath, the next heartbeat. The cold was no longer something she felt. It had become part of her, as fundamental as bone and blood. When she finally saw the dark shape emerging from the white, Sarah thought at first that she was hallucinating. The cold did that sometimes, she'd heard, made dying people see things that weren't there. But as she stumbled closer, the shape resolved into something real and solid, a cabin larger than her own, with smoke rising from its chimney and warm yellow light glowing behind shuttered windows. She made it to the door purely on instinct, her conscious mind no longer capable of directing her movements. Her frozen hands couldn't work the latch, so she simply fell against the heavy wood, too weak to even call out for help. Inside his fortress of solitude, Ezra Coleman heard the soft thump and looked up from the medical journal he'd been reading by lamplight. The sound was barely audible over the storm, but 15 years of mountain living had taught him to notice anything that didn't belong to the natural symphony of wind and snow. He set down the book and moved to the door, pressing his ear against the thick wood. For a moment he heard nothing but the storm. Then it came again, a faint scratching, like an animal seeking shelter. Ezra's first instinct was to ignore it. Mountain storms brought all sorts of desperate creatures to his door, and he'd learned long ago that getting involved with the troubles of others led only to pain. But something about the sound troubled him. It was too deliberate to be an animal, too weak to be a threat. Against his better judgment, he lifted the heavy bar that secured the door and cracked it open just wide enough to peer outside. Sarah collapsed inward as the door opened, her body a dead weight that nearly knocked him off balance. For a moment, Ezra stared down at the snow-covered form at his feet, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It had been so long since another human being had crossed his threshold that he almost couldn't recognize the bundle of wool and ice as a person. Then, training older than his hermit habits took over. Ezra dropped to his knees beside the unconscious woman, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a physician as he checked for breathing and pulse. Both were present but dangerously weak. Her skin was pale with a waxy quality that spoke of severe hypothermia, and ice crystals had formed in her hair and eyelashes. "Damn," he muttered. Then louder, "Damn it all, he couldn't leave her on his doorstep to die." But bringing her inside meant shattering the carefully constructed isolation that had been his protection for 15 years. It meant noise and disruption and the terrible complication of another person's needs and feelings. But it also meant using skills he'd thought he'd left behind forever. Skills that had once defined him as surely as his own name. Ezra slipped his arms under the unconscious woman and lifted her as gently as he could manage. She weighed almost nothing, he noticed, too little for someone who should be surviving on her own in the mountains. As he carried her toward the warmth of his hearth, he caught sight of something clutched in her frozen hand, the corner of what looked like a photograph, held so tightly that her fingers had cramped around it even in unconsciousness. He laid her on the thick bearskin rug before the fire and began the delicate process of warming someone who was dangerously close to freezing to death. Too much heat too quickly could be as deadly as the cold itself. Off came the ice-crusted outer clothes, replaced with dry wool blankets warmed by the fire. He massaged her hands and feet gently, working circulation back into extremities that showed the telltale white patches of frostbite. As he worked, Ezra found himself studying the woman's face. Even unconscious and blue with cold, she had a quality of quiet strength that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. Her features were fine but weathered by mountain sun and wind, and there were calluses on her hands that spoke of hard physical work. The photograph was still clutched in her right hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ezra gently pried her fingers open to examine it. The image was worn soft with handling, a young couple standing together. The woman clearly the same person now lying unconscious in his cabin. The man tall and serious-looking with carpenter's hands. A husband, then. Or at least someone who had been important enough for her to carry his image, even as she faced death in a blizzard. Ezra set the photograph on the mantelpiece where she would see it when she woke, then returned to his patient. Her breathing was stronger now, and some color was returning to her cheeks. She would live, assuming she didn't develop pneumonia or lose toes to frostbite. But she would also be his responsibility for however long the storm lasted, and possibly longer if her recovery was complicated. As if responding to his thoughts, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were brown, he noticed, the color of good earth, and they held a clarity that surprised him. She wasn't delirious or confused as he'd expected someone in her condition to be. "Where?" she began, then stopped as she took in her surroundings. The unfamiliar cabin, the bearded stranger kneeling beside her, the medical bag open on the floor nearby with its array of instruments and bottles. "You're safe," Ezra said quietly, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of silence. "You collapsed at my door during the storm. You were nearly frozen to death." Sarah's hand moved automatically to her coat pocket, then stopped as she realized she was no longer wearing her own clothes. Panic flared in her eyes as she looked around wildly. "The photograph," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a photograph." "There," Ezra said, pointing to the mantelpiece. "I had to take it from your hand, but it's safe." Relief flooded her features as she saw Thomas's image propped safely against the wooden cross. Only then did she seem to really see the man who had saved her life. The graying beard, the careful hands, the eyes that held depths of their own pain. "Thank you," she said simply. Ezra nodded once, already regretting the impulse that had made him open his door. But it was too late now. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the woman, his patient now, was in no condition to travel even if the weather improved. Like it or not, his solitude was broken. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of wood being split outside. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts. The ceiling above her was wrong, the walls unfamiliar, and the bed beneath her far more comfortable than the narrow cot she'd grown accustomed to in her own cabin. Then memory returned in a rush. The collapse, the desperate flight through the storm, the bearded stranger who had pulled her back from the edge of death. She sat up carefully, testing her body's responses. Her fingers and toes tingled with a burning sensation that told her she'd come close to serious frostbite, but everything seemed to be working properly. The cabin around her was a study in contradictions. On one hand, it was clearly the home of a man who valued solitude. Everything had its place, from the precisely arranged medical instruments to the books lined up with military precision on their shelves. But there were also signs of a life once lived differently. A woman's shawl hanging on a peg by the door, child-sized mittens tucked into a basket near the hearth, and most telling of all, the toy horse on the mantelpiece beside her photograph of Thomas. Sarah's wedding ring caught the morning light as she reached for the photograph, and she paused to look at it. The simple gold band that had felt so heavy on her finger these past 2 years. She'd hidden it away in her coat pocket yesterday morning, unable to bear wearing it while facing what she'd thought might be her final hours. Now, in this stranger's cabin, it felt like a secret she wasn't sure she was ready to share. She slipped the ring into the pocket of the borrowed nightgown she was wearing, clearly a woman's garment, though it was too big for her slight frame, and picked up Thomas's photograph instead. His serious face looked back at her, and she could almost hear his voice. "Be polite," Sarah, the man saved your life. The door opened with a gust of cold air, and Ezra Coleman stepped inside carrying an armload of split wood. He moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to doing everything for himself, but Sarah noticed the way his eyes avoided hers, the careful distance he maintained as he stacked the wood by the hearth. "Good morning," she said softly. He nodded in response but didn't speak, focusing instead on building up the fire. Sarah watched his hands work, surgeon's hands, she thought, remembering the medical bag and the gentle way he'd cared for her the night before. "I should introduce myself properly," she said, when the silence stretched too long. "I'm Sarah McKinnon. I had a cabin well, I suppose I should say I used to have a cabin about 20 miles down the mountain." "Ezra Coleman," he replied without looking up from the fire. His voice was rusty from disuse, she realized. How long had it been since he'd had a real conversation with another person? "Dr. Coleman?" she asked, nodding toward the medical bag. His hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. "Not anymore." The weight of those two words told Sarah more about her rescuer than a lengthy explanation might have. She recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when people in Copper Falls asked about her plans for the future, or whether she'd considered remarrying. Some subjects were too painful for casual conversation. "Well," she said carefully, "whatever you were before, I'm grateful for what you did last night. You saved my life." Ezra finally looked at her directly, and Sarah was struck by the intelligence in his grey eyes, tempered by a bone-deep weariness that she recognized all too well. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much loss. "Anyone would have done the same," he said. "No," Sarah replied with quiet certainty. "Not anyone. You could have ignored the sound at your door. Many people would have." He turned back to the fire without responding. But Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had hit closer to home than he'd like. "I'll need to check your hands and feet," he said abruptly, clearly changing the subject. "Frostbite can cause complications even after the initial danger has passed." Sarah extended her hands obediently, noting how carefully he avoided unnecessary contact as he examined her fingers. His touch was professional, impersonal, but she could feel the suppressed skill in his movements, muscle memory that spoke of years of healing others. "Some minor damage to the tips of your fingers," he said after a thorough examination, "but nothing that won't heal properly with care. Your feet fared better. The boots helped protect them. How long do you think the storm will last?" Sarah asked, as he wrapped her fingers in clean bandages. Ezra glanced toward the shuttered windows, where they could still hear the wind howling through the pines. "Hard to say. Could be days, could be a week or more. Mountain storms are unpredictable. A week or more." Sarah felt a flutter of panic at the thought of imposing on this clearly reluctant host for so long. She'd grown used to solitude herself, but it was the comfortable solitude of her own space, her own routines. Being trapped in someone else's sanctuary, especially someone who so obviously valued his privacy, was a different matter entirely. "I could try to make it down to Murphy's cabin," she offered. "Once the wind dies down a bit." "No." The word came out sharper than Ezra had intended, and he moderated his tone when he continued. "You're in no condition to travel, and Murphy's place is too far. You'll stay here until it's safe." There was something in his voice, a note of professional authority that brooked no argument, that made Sarah suspect Dr. Coleman wasn't as buried as he'd like her to. "Believe, then I'll try to help however I can," she said. "I know how to cook and I can mend clothes, or that's not necessary. It is to me." Sarah's voice carried its own note of quiet steel. "I won't be a burden any longer than I have to be." For the first time since she'd awakened, Ezra really looked at her, not as a patient to be managed, but as a person with her own will and dignity. What he saw seemed to surprise him. A woman who'd clearly learned to depend on herself, who carried responsibility with the same ease other women carried fans. "The coffee should be ready," he said finally, something approaching approval in his tone. "Over breakfast. Simple fare of oatmeal and preserved fruit." But prepared with care, Sarah began to piece together more of her host's story. The cabin was too well appointed for a simple hermit's retreat. The books on the shelves included advanced medical texts alongside philosophy and literature. The surgical instruments, though unused, were of the highest quality. Most telling of all was the way he moved through the space. This wasn't a man camping out in the wilderness. This was someone who had deliberately created a new life in isolation, complete with all the comforts and tools his previous existence had required. "You built this place yourself?" Sarah asked, admiring the precise joinery of the log walls. "Mostly." Ezra's eyes drifted to the toy horse on the mantelpiece. "I had some help with the planning." Sarah followed his gaze and understood. The woman's shawl, the child's mittens, the oversized nightgown she was wearing. This cabin had been built for a family that was no longer here. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Ezra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "For what?" "For whatever brought you to these mountains." I recognize the look. It's the same one I see in my own mirror sometimes. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of wind through the trees. Then Ezra stood abruptly, gathering the breakfast dishes with movements that were just a little too sharp, a little too controlled. "I need to check the livestock," he said without looking at her. "There are books if you want something to read. And Sarah," he paused at the door, his hand on the latch, "don't go outside. The storm's worse than it sounds from in here." After he left, Sarah sat in the sudden silence, holding Thomas's photograph and thinking about the man who had saved her life. Clearly, Dr. Ezra Coleman was running from something just as surely as she was running to something. The question was whether two people fleeing in opposite directions could find any common ground in the space between their respective forms of solitude. She slipped the wedding ring from her pocket and turned it over in her palm, watching the gold catch the firelight. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, trapping her with a stranger who seemed as damaged by life as she was. But for the first time in 2 years, Sarah found herself curious about someone else's story, and wondering if perhaps isolation wasn't the only way to honor the dead. By the 3rd day of the storm, Sarah had discovered that sharing a small space with Ezra Coleman was like learning to dance with a partner who kept forgetting the steps. He would begin to relax, engaging in something approaching normal conversation, only to catch himself and retreat behind walls of polite but distant civility. She found evidence of his internal struggle in small things. The way he automatically set out 2 cups for morning coffee before remembering he wasn't used to company, or how he would start to tell her something about the mountain wildlife before cutting himself off mid-sentence. Most telling of all was the way his eyes would linger on the toy horse whenever he thought she wasn't looking. His expression cycling through grief, guilt, and something that looked almost like fear. Sarah's own adjustment to the situation was complicated by her discovery of the half-finished quilt tucked away in a wooden chest near the window. She'd been looking for additional blankets. Ezra kept the cabin warm enough, but her body was still recovering from its brush with freezing when her fingers encountered the soft fabric. The quilt was beautiful work, executed in a pattern of interlocking rings that would have taken months to complete. The stitching was precise and even, the work of someone who took pride in doing things properly. But it was clearly unfinished, perhaps half done, with the needle still threaded and stuck through the fabric as if the quilter had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. "You shouldn't go through other people's belongings." Sarah turned to find Ezra standing in the doorway, his arms full of firewood and his expression unreadable. She hadn't heard him come in over the sound of the wind. "I'm sorry," she said, making no move to hide the quilt. "I was looking for another blanket and I found this. It's lovely work. Put it back." There was pain in his voice now, raw and immediate, but Sarah didn't immediately comply. Instead, she ran her fingers over the careful stitching, recognizing the same precision she saw in everything Ezra did. "She was skilled," Sarah said quietly. "Whoever made this had real talent." "Sarah, my mother tried to teach me to quilt when I was young," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "I never had the patience for it. Too eager to see the finished product, to enjoy the process of making it. But I can appreciate good work when I see it. Ezra set down the firewood with careful control, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Her name was Anna, he said finally, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. She started that quilt the winter before. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Before she died, Sarah said gently. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. Ezra nodded once, sharp and painful. She never got to finish it. I found her. I found them both. You don't have to tell me, Sarah said quickly, seeing how the words were costing him. I understand about things left unfinished, but Ezra seemed unable to stop now that he'd started. Diphtheria outbreak in town. I was the only doctor for 50 miles, working day and night, trying to save other people's children while my own. His voice broke. I couldn't save them. All my training, all my skill, and I couldn't save my own family. Sarah stood slowly, still holding the quilt. Is that why you came here? Because you blame yourself? I don't blame myself, Ezra said with bitter precision. I know it was my fault. If I'd been home instead of trying to play hero to half the territory, you were doing your job, Sarah interrupted. You were trying to save lives, the wrong lives. The words exploded from him with such force that Sarah took an involuntary step backward. I should have been protecting my family, not everyone else's. Anna told me she was feeling unwell, asked me to stay home that day, but I was too important, too needed elsewhere. So I left, and while I was treating other people's children, mine and my wife died alone. The silence that followed was heavy, with 15 years of accumulated guilt and self-recrimination. Sarah could see the weight of it in Ezra's posture, the way it had carved lines around his eyes and turned his hair prematurely grey. How old? She asked quietly. What? Your child. How old? Ezra's eyes went to the toy horse on the mantelpiece. 7. David was 7. Sarah nodded, thinking of Thomas, of the children they'd planned to have but never got the chance to bring into the world. Different losses, but the same fundamental ache of dreams cut short. Thomas and I tried for 3 years to have a baby, she said, settling back down with the quilt spread across her lap. We lost 2 before they could draw breath, and then Thomas died before we could try again. Sometimes I wonder if that was a mercy, not bringing children into a world where they could be taken so easily. It wasn't a mercy for David, Ezra said harshly. He loved life. Loved learning, loved exploring the woods around our house. He would have grown up to do something important, something that mattered, and instead his life mattered to you and Anna, Sarah said simply. That's not nothing. Ezra slumped into the chair across from her, suddenly looking every one of his 50-odd years. Anna always said that too. That love was its own justification, even if it ended in loss. But she was always better at faith than I was. Sarah smoothed the quilt fabric between her fingers, feeling the echo of another woman's careful work. Would she want you to live like this? Alone, cutting yourself off from everything that might bring meaning? She'd want me to be happy, Ezra admitted. But I don't know how to be that anymore. I don't even know if I deserve to be. Deserve has nothing to do with it, Sarah said, with quiet conviction. Happiness isn't something you earn. It's something you choose, day by day, despite all the reasons not to. You sound like you speak from experience. Sarah smiled sadly. I'm still learning the lesson myself. Some days I choose to get up and feed the chickens and tend the garden because it's what Thomas would have wanted. Other days I do it because it's what I want, and I'm surprised to discover there's a difference. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the storm still raging outside, but seeming somehow less threatening now that they'd shared the weight of their respective losses. Sarah found herself studying the quilt pattern more carefully, imagining Anna Coleman's hands guiding the needle, creating something beautiful and lasting, even though she wouldn't live to see it completed. I could finish it, she said suddenly. Ezra looked up sharply. What? The quilt. I could finish it. I may not have my mother's patience, but I know the basics. It would take time, especially working with these. She held up her bandaged fingers. But I could do it. No. The word came out flat and final. I couldn't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. It seems wrong to leave it unfinished when it's so close to being done. Ezra stared at the quilt as if it were a live thing, dangerous and unpredictable. Why would you want to do that? Sarah considered the question seriously. Because someone put love into every stitch, and that deserves to be honored. Because beautiful things shouldn't be left incomplete if there's a way to finish them. And because... She hesitated, then continued with complete honesty. Because I need something to do with my hands while I'm trapped here, and this feels more worthwhile than reading all your medical journals. Despite himself, Ezra's mouth quirked upward at that. You've been reading my medical journals? Just the ones about mountain medicine and cold weather injuries? Professional interest, you might say. Sarah's own smile was wry. Amazing how much there is to learn about the various ways isolation and harsh weather can kill you. And yet you stayed alone in these mountains for 2 years. And yet you've stayed alone for 15, Sarah countered. We're both either very brave or very foolish, or very stubborn, Ezra suggested. That too. Another comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the omnipresent sound of wind and snow outside. Sarah found herself thinking about the careful way Ezra had cared for her injuries, the professional competence that he couldn't quite hide, despite his claims of no longer being a doctor. You miss it, she said. The medicine. It wasn't a question, and Ezra didn't pretend to misunderstand. Some parts of it. The puzzle of diagnosis, the satisfaction of helping someone heal, but not... He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Not the responsibility, Sarah said softly. Not having other people's lives in your hands. Ezra nodded, his expression distant. Every decision I made affected someone else's future. Every mistake could mean death or permanent disability. The weight of that, it becomes crushing after a while. But you were good at it, Sarah observed. I can tell from the way you move, the way you handled my injuries. That kind of skill doesn't come from someone who was just going through the motions. Being good at something doesn't mean you're suited for it, Ezra said. I was a skilled surgeon, but perhaps not cut out for the emotional demands of the profession. Sarah looked down at the quilt again, thinking about Anna Coleman and the child who would never grow up, about Thomas and the life they'd never gotten to build together. So much loss, so much unfinished business in the world. Would you mind if I worked on it? She asked again. The quilt, I mean. I promised to be careful with it. Ezra was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She always said that quilts were like lives, made up of individual pieces that only made sense when you could see the whole pattern. Maybe... He stopped, took a shaky breath. Maybe it would be good for someone to see how this one was supposed to turn out. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she'd shed since her cabin collapsed. I'll do my best to honor her vision. I know you will, Ezra said. And for the first time since she'd met him, his smile reached his eyes. The morning of the 5th day brought something neither Sarah nor Ezra had dared hope for. Silence. Not the oppressive quiet of the tomb, but the clean, crystalline silence that follows a mountain storm. A peace so profound it seemed to ring like a bell in the thin air. Sarah woke first, instantly aware of the change. She lay still for a moment, listening to the absence of wind, before rising carefully from her makeshift bed by the fire. The bandages on her fingers made her movements clumsy, but the constant tingling had faded to an occasional twinge, and she could flex her hands without pain. Ezra was already awake. She discovered, standing by the shuttered window with his ear pressed to the wood. The lines of tension that had marked his shoulders for days had eased somewhat, and when he turned to meet her gaze, she saw something like relief in his grey eyes. Storms past, he said unnecessarily. Should we look outside? Ezra nodded and moved to unbar the shutters. The wooden panels swung open to reveal a world transformed into something from a fairy tale. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls to a height of nearly 4 feet, creating smooth, sculptural curves that caught and reflected the morning light like spun silver. The trees stood laden with white, their branches bent under the weight but unbroken, and the sky above was the deep, endless blue that only came after mountain storms had cleared the air completely. Beautiful, Sarah breathed, forgetting for a moment the destruction that same storm had wrought on her own life. And dangerous, Ezra added pragmatically. That's at least 3 feet of new snow on top of what was already on the ground. Travel will be impossible for weeks, maybe months, depending on how the spring thaw goes. Sarah felt a flutter of something that might have been panic or might have been relief. Months? The trail down to the main valley will be impassable until at least April, possibly May. Even if someone tried to reach us with supplies, they'd never make it through the drifts. Ezra glanced at her sideways, trying to read her reaction. I have enough food and firewood to last, but I understand if the prospect of being trapped here that long is— Actually, Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with the honesty of her response. It's been nice having someone to talk to. The admission hung between them, fragile as ice crystals. Ezra studied her face as if trying to determine whether she was simply being polite. I thought you might be going stir-crazy by now, he said carefully. Sharing space with a stranger, especially someone who isn't used to company. You've been a gracious host, Sarah said, which was true as far as it went. Ezra had been unfailingly polite, even kind, but always with that careful distance that suggested he was constantly fighting his own impulses toward human connection. I haven't been much of anything in a long time, Ezra admitted. I'd forgotten how to have conversations that weren't with myself. Sarah moved to stand beside him at the window, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from the glass, but careful not to crowd him. In the days they'd spent together, she'd learned to read his moods, to recognize when he needed space and when he was simply afraid to reach for connection. We could dig out, she said, watching a red-winged hawk circle overhead, riding the currents above the pristine snowfield. Make a path to your woodshed and barn. It would give us something to do besides sit inside and think too much. Ezra looked at her bandaged hands. Your fingers are healing fine, thanks to your excellent medical care, Sarah finished firmly. And I'm going to go crazy if I don't have some useful work to do soon. Digging snow isn't exactly light work. Neither was splitting wood and hauling water for 2 years. But I managed that well enough. Sarah's tone carried a note of gentle challenge. I'm stronger than I look, Dr. Coleman. Something shifted in Ezra's expression at her use of his title. Not the retreat she'd come to expect, but a different kind of recognition. Ezra, he said quietly. Just Ezra. I haven't been Dr. Coleman for a long time. Then just Sarah, she replied. We're going to be living together for months, apparently. We might as well be on a first-name basis, living together. Ezra repeated the phrase as if testing its weight. That's what we're doing, isn't it? That's what we're doing, Sarah confirmed. The question is whether we're going to spend that time walking on eggshells around each other, or whether we're going to try to make the best of an unusual situation. Before Ezra could respond, a sound from outside caught both their attention, a low, howling call that echoed across the snowfield. Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck rise as the call was answered from another direction, then another. Wolves, Ezra said grimly, his entire posture changing from relaxed to alert in an instant. The storm will have driven the elk down from the high country, and the pack follows the prey. Are we safe here? For now. But they'll be hungry, and wolves are clever. If they catch the scent of my livestock— He was already moving away from the window, gathering equipment with practiced efficiency. We need to check on the animals and make sure the barn is secure. Sarah followed him as he pulled on heavy boots and a thick coat, noting the way he automatically checked the loads in the rifle by the door. This was the Ezra who had survived 15 years alone in the wilderness, she realized, competent, decisive, and utterly focused on the practical demands of mountain life. What can I do to help? Ezra paused in his preparations to look at her, really look at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. What he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded and reached for a second coat hanging by the door. Bundle up warm. The cold out there will bite through anything that isn't properly covered. And stay close to me. Wolves won't usually attack humans, but a pack in winter can be unpredictable. The coat he handed her was clearly Anna's, Sarah realized as she slipped it on. It was well made and warm, but too short in the sleeves and loose through the body. Still, it smelled faintly of lavender and something indefinably feminine. And Sarah felt a pang of connection to the woman who had worn it before her. Outside, the snow was deeper than it had appeared from the window. Even with Ezra breaking trail, Sarah found herself sinking to her knees with each step, the snow infiltrating her borrowed boots and soaking through the wool stockings underneath. But there was something exhilarating about being outdoors again after days of confinement, breathing air so cold and clean it seemed to crystallize in her lungs. The barn was a sturdy structure built into the hillside behind the cabin, its roof steep enough to shed snow and its walls thick enough to retain heat. Inside, Sarah could hear the restless movements of animals made nervous by the wolf calls that continued to echo across the valley. 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and an old mule, Ezra explained as he checked the heavy bar that secured the barn door. Not much, but it's enough to keep me in fresh milk and eggs through the winter. And if the wolves get in, then I'll be eating a lot more venison and a lot fewer eggs come spring, Ezra said pragmatically. But they'll have to work for it. I didn't survive this long by making things easy for predators. As if summoned by his words, a grey shape appeared at the edge of the tree line, a wolf larger than any dog Sarah had ever seen, its yellow eyes fixed on the barn with unmistakable hunger. It was followed by another, then another, until a half-dozen animals stood at the edge of the clearing, their breath steaming in the cold air. Beautiful creatures, Sarah murmured, unable to suppress a shiver of admiration despite the threat they represented. Deadly ones, Ezra corrected, but his tone held its own note of respect. The pack leader there, the big male with the grey ruff, I've seen him before. He's been testing my defenses for 3 winters now, always probing for weakness. As they watched, the lead wolf took a deliberate step forward, then another. The pack followed his lead, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Sarah could feel Ezra tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle he carried. They're coming closer. Testing us, Ezra agreed. Trying to determine if we're a threat or just another source of food. The standoff continued for several long minutes. Human and wolf locked in a battle of wills that was as old as the mountains themselves. Then, without warning, Ezra raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air above the pack. The sound echoed like thunder across the snow-covered valley, and the wolves scattered instantly, melting back into the tree line as if they had never been there at all. But Sarah caught a glimpse of the pack leader as he retreated, a final measuring look that suggested this was far from over. Will they be back? Count on it, Ezra said, lowering the rifle. But not today. The gunshot will keep them nervous for a while, and they'll need time to assess the threat level. As they made their way back to the cabin, Sarah found herself thinking about the look that had passed between Ezra and the wolf, a recognition between 2 solitary predators who understood each other's nature. It struck her that in some ways, Ezra had more in common with the wolves than he did with the human society he'd abandoned. Back inside the warmth of the cabin, as they shed their snow-caked outer garments and moved to warm themselves by the fire, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. On the table where she'd been working on Anna's quilt, sitting beside her sewing supplies, like it belonged there, was a small wooden object she'd never seen before. It was a pocket watch, its gold case tarnished with age, but clearly valuable. The kind of timepiece a man might inherit from his father and pass down to his own son in turn. Sarah picked it up carefully, noting the way the metal was worn smooth where a thumb might rest. The small dent in one side that spoke of a life well lived. This wasn't here when we left, she said. Holding up the watch, Ezra looked up from where he was hanging his coat by the fire, and Sarah saw surprise flicker across his features. I haven't seen that in... He stopped, moved closer to examine the watch in her hands. I thought I'd lost it years ago. It belonged to my father and his father before him. Where did you find it? I didn't. It was just there, on the table where you've been working. Ezra's voice held a note of wonder that made him sound younger, less burdened. I searched everywhere when I first realized it was missing. Tore the cabin apart, looking for it. Sarah turned the watch over in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the sense of history it carried. On the back she could make out an engraving worn almost smooth by time. "To my beloved son, may you always find your way home." "It's beautiful," she said, offering it back to him. But Ezra shook his head. "You found it. You should be the one to wind it, see if it still works." Sarah looked down at the watch, then back at Ezra's face. There was something in his expression, hope maybe, or the faint possibility of faith that made her understand this was about more than just a found timepiece. She turned the small crown carefully, feeling the spring mechanism catch and hold. For a moment nothing happened. Then with a soft tick that seemed loud in the quiet cabin, the watch began to keep time again. "It works," she said softly. "After all these years," Ezra marveled. "I thought it was broken beyond repair." Sarah handed him the watch, noting how carefully he cradled it in his hands, the way his thumb automatically found that worn spot on the case. "Maybe some things just need the right moment to start working again." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Sarah felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in the quality of attention they paid to each other. For the first time since she'd awakened in his cabin, Ezra wasn't looking at her like a problem to be solved or a responsibility to be managed. He was looking at her like a woman, and she was looking back, 2 weeks after the storm had passed. Sarah discovered that living with Ezra Coleman was like learning to read a book written in a language she was only beginning to understand. He had layers upon layers of carefully constructed defenses, each one designed to keep the world at a safe distance. But occasionally something would slip through, an unguarded smile, a moment of genuine laughter, a comment that revealed depths of loneliness he usually kept hidden. The quilt had become her window into those depths. As she worked on Anna's unfinished pattern, adding stitches to stitches in the quiet hours when the mountain wind spoke in whispers rather than shouts, Ezra would sometimes sit nearby and tell her stories. Not about Anna directly, that pain was still too raw to approach head-on, but about the life they'd built. Together, before the diphtheria took everything away, she had a way with plants, he said one evening as Sarah carefully joined 2 pieces of fabric in the intricate ring pattern. Could coax flowers to bloom in soil that shouldn't have supported weeds. The first year we were married, she turned a patch of rocky ground behind our house into a garden that was the envy of the whole town. Sarah looked up from her stitching to find Ezra staring into the fire, his expression soft with memory. What was her favorite flower? Wildflowers. She said cultivated flowers were beautiful, but wild ones had character. Every spring, she'd take David into the woods to hunt for the first blooms. Trillium, Indian paintbrush, wild columbine. She'd press the best specimens between the pages of books. Do you still have them? The pressed flowers? Ezra nodded toward the shelf of medical texts. Scattered through those journals like bookmarks. I used to find them when I was studying, little reminders of beauty in the middle of anatomy diagrams and disease classifications. Sarah felt her heart contract with sympathy. How hard it must have been for him, in those first terrible months after their deaths, to open a book and find those tangible reminders of Anna's gentle presence everywhere. "Would you show me?" she asked softly. For a moment she thought he would refuse. The request was too intimate, too much like asking him to open old wounds for her inspection. But after a long pause, Ezra rose and pulled one of the journals from the shelf, a thick volume on surgical procedures that looked well used. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, then held the book open so Sarah could see. There, pressed between descriptions of battlefield amputations and emergency surgery techniques, was a perfect wild columbine, its delicate blue and white petals still intact after 15 years, still holding the ghost of their original color. "Beautiful," Sarah breathed. struck by the contrast between the flower's fragile beauty and the harsh medical realities surrounding it. She always said beauty could survive anywhere if you were determined enough to preserve it, Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. Even in the darkest places. Sarah looked from the pressed flower to Ezra's face, seeing in his expression the same careful preservation, a man trying to keep something beautiful alive in the darkness of his own grief. She sounds like she was wise. Wiser than me, Ezra admitted. I was always so focused on fixing things, on solving problems through knowledge and skill. Anna understood that some things couldn't be fixed, only accepted and treasured for what they were. Is that why you became a hermit? Because you couldn't fix what happened to them? Ezra closed the book carefully, his hands gentle with its weight. I became a hermit because I couldn't face the possibility of failing someone else the way I failed them. Up here alone, the only person I can hurt with my limitations is myself. But you saved me, Sarah pointed out. When I collapsed at your door, you didn't hesitate to help. Your instincts were to heal, not to protect yourself. That was different. You were already dying. There was nothing to lose. There was everything to lose, Sarah said with quiet conviction. Your solitude, your carefully constructed isolation, your protection from caring about another person's fate. You gave all of that up the moment you opened your door. Ezra looked at her sharply, as if she'd identified something he hadn't fully realized himself. I suppose I did. Why? I don't know, he admitted. Instinct, maybe. Or maybe I was just tired of being alone with my ghosts. The honesty of the admission hung between them, like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah bent back to her stitching, giving Ezra space to retreat if he needed to, but also leaving the door open for him to continue. What about you? He asked after a moment. What kept you in those mountains alone for 2 years? It couldn't have been easy, a woman managing a homestead by herself. It wasn't easy, Sarah confirmed, her needle moving in steady, meditative strokes. But it was honest work, and it kept me close to the life Thomas and I had planned together. Every improvement I made to the place, every challenge I overcame, it felt like I was completing something we'd started. Even when it was dangerous? Even when you must have been lonely? Sarah paused in her sewing to consider the question seriously. The loneliness was the hardest part. Not the physical solitude, I actually came to enjoy that. But the emotional isolation, the sense that no one else understood why I needed to stay, why I couldn't just move to town and start over like a sensible widow should. People didn't understand. People meant well, Sarah said diplomatically. But they couldn't see past the practical difficulties to understand what I was fighting to preserve. They saw a woman making foolish choices out of sentiment. I saw someone honoring a promise. What promise? Sarah's hand moved automatically to her coat pocket, where Thomas's photograph rested alongside the wedding ring she still couldn't bring herself to wear. We promised each other we'd build something lasting. A home, a life, maybe a family if we were blessed with children. When Thomas died, I felt like giving up on the homestead would be breaking faith with that promise. And now, after losing the cabin, now I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, Sarah admitted. The life I was trying to preserve is gone, but I'm still here. I have to figure out what comes next. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression that suggested he was wrestling with his own version of the same question. Maybe that's what we're both doing here, he said finally. Figuring out what comes next. Maybe, Sarah agreed. Though I have to say, if someone had told me a month ago that I'd be spending the winter sharing a cabin with a hermit doctor while learning to finish another woman's quilt, I'd have thought they were telling stories. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, Ezra observed. That it does. Sarah held up the section of quilt she'd been working on, examining her stitches in the firelight. They weren't as perfectly even as Anna's work, but they were getting better with practice. I think I'm starting to understand her pattern, the way the rings interconnect. It's more complex than it appears at first glance. Most worthwhile things are, Ezra said, and Sarah had the sense he wasn't talking about quilting anymore, as if summoned by the intimacy of the moment. The wolf pack announced its presence with a chorus of howls that echoed across the snow-covered valley. Sarah looked up from her sewing to find Ezra already moving toward the rifle, his face set in lines of grim determination. "They're closer tonight," he said, checking the weapon's load with practiced efficiency. "How can you tell?" "The sound carries differently when they're near the cabin. We'll need to check the barn again, make sure the animals are secure." But as they moved toward the door, prepared to venture out into the cold night, a new sound stopped them both in their tracks. It wasn't the howl of a hunting pack or the rustle of wind through snow-laden pines. It was the sharp crack of breaking wood, followed by a distinctly human cry of pain and alarm. "Someone's out there," Sarah said unnecessarily. Ezra was already reaching for his heaviest coat, his expression grim with the knowledge of what exposure meant in these temperatures. "Stay inside. Draw the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone but me. You can't go out there alone." "I can and I will," Ezra cut her off with quiet authority. "This is exactly the kind of situation I came here to avoid. But I won't let someone die on my doorstep because I'm too much of a coward to help." Before Sarah could argue further, he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness beyond the door. She stood for a moment with her hand on the heavy wooden bar, and torn between the desire to follow him and the practical knowledge that she would only be a liability in the dangerous conditions outside. Instead, she moved to the window and pressed her face to the cold glass, trying to make out shapes in the snow-reflected moonlight. She could see Ezra's lantern bobbing across the clearing, hear voices calling to each other in the distance. But the details were lost in darkness and blowing snow. It seemed like hours before the door opened again, though Sarah's newly repaired pocket watch told her it had been less than 30 minutes. Ezra stumbled inside, supporting a figure wrapped in blankets, followed by two more people who moved with the careful steps of those who had pushed themselves to the very edge of endurance. "Travelers," Ezra said tersely as Sarah hurried to help. "Got caught in an avalanche coming down the pass. One's got a broken leg. The others are hypothermic." Sarah looked at the three strangers now filling Ezra's carefully ordered sanctuary and felt the foundations of their isolated world shifting beneath her feet. Whatever fragile equilibrium she and Ezra had been building together, it was about to be tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. The three travelers turned out to be a family, a man, his wife, and their teenage son, who had been attempting to reach relatives in Copper Falls when the avalanche caught them. The father, a stocky man named Henrik Larsson, had a compound fracture of his left leg that required immediate attention. His wife, Ingrid, and their son, Lars, were suffering from moderate hypothermia, but would recover with warmth and rest. Sarah watched in fascination as Ezra transformed before her eyes. Gone was the hesitant hermit who flinched from human contact. In his place stood a man of absolute competence and authority, his hands steady as he set Henrik's broken bone, his voice calm and reassuring as he explained each procedure to the frightened family. "The break is clean," he told them as he worked, his surgical instruments laid out with precise care on a cloth beside the makeshift operating table. "No major blood vessels damaged, and the bone alignment is good. He'll heal properly with rest and proper care." "Thank God you were here," Ingrid whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "We thought we were going to die out there." "You're safe now," Ezra said simply. But Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the weight of that promise was not lost on him. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself serving as an unofficial nurse, boiling water for sterilizing instruments, preparing hot drinks for the patients, and helping Ezra monitor Henrik's condition for signs of infection or shock. It was nearly dawn before the immediate crisis had passed, and the family was sleeping peacefully near the fire. "You were magnificent," Sarah told Ezra quietly, as they finally sat down with cups of coffee, both of them exhausted but oddly exhilarated by the night's work. "I was terrified," Ezra admitted. "Every moment I was waiting for something to go wrong, for my skills to fail when these people needed them most. But they didn't fail. You saved that man's life, and probably his family's as well." "This time," Ezra said darkly. But what about next time? What happens when I make the wrong choice, give the wrong treatment, lose someone who trusted me to heal them? Sarah studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the weight of old fears and newer doubts warring in his expression. What happened the night Anna and David died, Ezra? Really happened, not the version you've been telling yourself for 15 years. Ezra's hand stilled on his coffee cup. I told you I was treating other patients when I should have been home. That's what you did, not what happened. Tell me about that night. For a long moment, Sarah thought he would refuse. The request was too direct, too much like forcing him to relive his worst memories for her satisfaction. But something in the events of the past few hours seemed to have shaken loose his usual defenses. There were 12 cases of diphtheria in town, he began slowly. Children mostly ranging in age from 3 to 15. The disease had come up from the mining camps, and it was spreading fast. I'd been working for 36 hours straight when Anna sent word that she wasn't feeling well. Sent word. She didn't come to see you herself? She was afraid of spreading infection if she was coming down with something. Always thinking of others, always careful not to add to my burdens. Ezra's voice cracked slightly. I sent back a message saying I'd be home as soon as I finished with the Henderson boy. He was the worst case, barely breathing, needed constant monitoring. How long did that take? 6 hours. By the time I got home, Anna was unconscious and David was... He stopped, unable to continue. Already dead, Sarah said gently. Ezra nodded, his face a mask of controlled anguish. The disease had progressed too quickly. Even if I'd been there from the first symptoms, I don't think I could have saved them. But the town, they needed someone to blame for losing 2 of their own. They blamed you? Not officially. But there were whispers, suggestions that I'd prioritize strangers over my own family. That maybe if I'd been a better doctor or a better husband, Anna and David would still be alive. Ezra set down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. The worst part was, I agreed with them. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So you left. I ran, Ezra corrected with bitter honesty. Like a coward. Instead of fighting the accusations or defending my choices, I packed up everything I could carry and disappeared into these mountains. Were the accusations true? Does it matter? My family was dead, and I was alive, and I couldn't see a way to live with that reality while staying in the place where it happened. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd told her. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters and reminding them that despite the warmth of the cabin, they were still at the mercy of forces beyond their control. How many of the other children survived? She asked finally. What? The 12 cases you were treating when Anna fell ill. How many survived? Ezra looked puzzled by the question. 11. Only the Henderson boy died, despite everything I tried. So you saved 11 children's lives that night. But I lost my wife and son. Yes, Sarah agreed sadly. You did. But that doesn't negate the fact that 11 other families didn't have to face what you faced. 11 other children grew up, got married, had families of their own because of the choice you made to stay and treat them. It doesn't feel like enough, Ezra said quietly. It never does, Sarah replied. The weight of loss always feels heavier than the weight of lives saved. But that doesn't make your choice wrong, Ezra. It makes it heroic. Heroic. Ezra's laugh was harsh and bitter. Heroes don't abandon their communities when they're needed most. Heroes don't spend 15 years hiding from their responsibilities. Heroes are human beings who make impossible choices and then have to live with the consequences, Sarah corrected firmly. You chose to save who you could, even though it meant risking everything you loved most. That's not cowardice. That's the kind of moral courage most people never have to test. Before Ezra could respond, young Lars Larson stirred on his makeshift bed near the fire, calling out softly for his mother. Sarah moved to check on him, noting with relief that his color was much improved and his breathing was steady and strong. The doctor saved Papa's life, didn't he? The boy asked quietly when he saw Sarah kneeling beside him. Yes, Sarah said simply. He did. Papa said Dr. Coleman was the best physician in 3 territories, back before he came to the mountains. Said people used to travel for days just to have him look at their injuries. Sarah felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. Dr. Coleman, your father knew Ezra before tonight? Oh, yes. Everyone in Copper Falls knows about Dr. Coleman. There's even a wanted poster for him down at the marshal's office. Though Papa says most folks think it's a shame they're still looking for him after all these years. A wanted poster. Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. Lars nodded sleepily. For abandoning his patients during the diphtheria outbreak. Technically, it's desertion of medical duty during a public health emergency. But Papa says the charges were trumped up by folks who needed someone to blame for their losses. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. She glanced toward Ezra, who was sitting frozen by the fire, his face pale with the realization that his carefully guarded secret had just been exposed by an innocent boy's casual conversation. "Lars," she said carefully, "you should rest now. Your family has been through enough for one night." The boy nodded and closed his eyes, but Sarah could see that sleep wouldn't come easily for any of them now. She rose slowly and moved back to where Ezra sat staring into the flames, his expression that of a man watching his world collapse for the second time in his life. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, not looking at her. "I just found out. Lars thought I already knew. He assumed anyone staying with you would know about your past. And now that you do know, now that you understand, you've been living with a wanted man, a criminal who abandoned his responsibilities when people needed him most." Sarah sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Now I know I've been living with a man who made the hardest choice any healer can make, who to save when you can't save everyone, and who has been punishing himself for that choice ever since. The law doesn't see it that way. The law is often wrong about matters of conscience," Sarah said firmly. "You know what you did that night was right, even if you can't make yourself feel it yet." Ezra finally looked at her, his gray eyes holding depths of pain that 15 years hadn't been able to heal. "Why aren't you afraid of me? Why aren't you demanding that I take you to town as soon as the snow melts so you can turn me in for the reward?" "Because," Sarah said, reaching over to take his hand in hers, "I've spent weeks watching you care for my injuries, sharing your food and shelter. And tonight, I watched you risk your own safety to save strangers. Whatever the law says about Dr. Ezra Coleman, I know the man you are now. And that man is good. You don't understand the full scope of what I've done." "I understand enough," Sarah interrupted. "I understand that you've been carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry, and fear that's kept you from using gifts that could help people. Most of all, I understand that running from the past doesn't change it. It only prevents you from building a better future." "What are you saying?" Sarah squeezed his hand gently, feeling the calluses from years of mountain work, the steadiness that had saved her life and now Henrik Larsson's. "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to face whatever's waiting for you down in Copper Falls and deal with it honestly. And if they arrest me, if I end up in prison or worse, then at least you'll know you faced your fears with courage instead of spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been." Sarah smiled at him, hoping her own courage was stronger than it felt. "Besides, you won't be facing it alone." "Sarah, I'm not going anywhere, Ezra, not unless you tell me to leave. We're in this together now, whatever comes next." For the first time since Lars had spoken the words that changed everything, Ezra's expression softened. He turned his hand palm up beneath hers, intertwining their fingers with a gentleness that made Sarah's heart skip. "Together," he repeated, as if testing the weight of a word he'd thought he'd never use again. "Together," Sarah confirmed, and felt the last of her own walls crumble as she admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with this broken, brilliant, courageous man, and she would stand by him no matter what the future held. The spring thaw began 3 weeks after the Larsson family's rescue, arriving with the subtle persistence of hope itself. First came the sound of dripping from the cabin's eaves, then the soft whisper of snow sliding from the pine boughs, and finally the distant music of running water as the mountain streams began to flow again beneath their winter ice. Sarah had spent those weeks in a state of careful suspension, writing letters she wasn't sure she'd ever send, while watching Ezra wrestle with demons that had haunted him for 15 years. The revelation of his wanted status had changed something fundamental between them, not destroying the trust they'd built, but adding layers of complexity and urgency that neither had been prepared for. The Larson family had departed as soon as Henrik could travel, grateful and discreet, promising to say nothing about their rescuer's identity to anyone in Copper Falls, but their presence had been a reminder of the world beyond the cabin walls, the world that still held legal consequences for choices made long ago in desperation and grief. "The letter is finished," Sarah announced one morning, holding up the pages she'd been laboring over for days. "I've documented everything. The night Anna and David died, the circumstances that led to your leaving, the medical care you've provided up here, including saving Henrik's life. It's addressed to the territorial marshal." Ezra looked up from the chess game he'd been playing against himself, his expression unreadable. "You want to send it?" "I want to give you the choice," Sarah corrected. "You can send it, or we can burn it, or we can wait and see what happens when the trails are fully passable. But I wanted you to know that if you decide to face this thing directly, you won't be facing it without evidence in your favor. Evidence that I abandoned my post during a medical emergency," Ezra said grimly. "Evidence that you made an impossible choice under extraordinary circumstances, and that the charges against you were politically motivated rather than legally sound." Sarah set the letter on the table between them, next to the chessboard where his game remained frozen in an eternal stalemate. "Evidence that you've continued to practice medicine even in exile, saving lives when the opportunity arose. And if the marshal doesn't see it that way, then at least you'll know you tried to set things right," Sarah said firmly. "And you'll know that someone believes in your innocence enough to stake her own reputation on it." Ezra studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Your reputation? Sarah, if you're associated with a wanted man—" "I'm already associated with a wanted man," she interrupted. "I've been living with one for months, helping him, caring for him, falling in love with him. If that's not association, I don't know what is." The words hung in the air between them, more honest than either had been prepared for. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with the admission, but she didn't look away. It was time for truth, all of it, no matter how vulnerable it made her feel. "Sarah," Ezra began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I know this complicates things. I know you didn't ask for my feelings, and I'm not demanding anything in return. But I won't let you face this alone, and I won't pretend that what's grown between us these past months doesn't matter." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I've spent 15 years believing I didn't deserve happiness, that caring for someone would only lead to more loss and guilt. But you—" He reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "You make me want to believe in second chances." "Then believe," Sarah said simply. "Believe in yourself. Believe in us. Believe that good people can overcome bad circumstances if they're brave enough to try. And if I can't clear my name, if the charges stand and I have to face consequences for what I did, then we'll face them together," Sarah said without hesitation. "I didn't survive 2 winters alone in these mountains to be frightened off by legal troubles." Ezra lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth racing up her arm. "I love you too, Sarah McKinnon. I tried not to, tried to keep my distance, but you're the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known. If you're willing to stand with me, then maybe I can find the courage to stand up for myself. So we send the letter." "We send the letter," Ezra confirmed, "and then we prepare for whatever response it brings." The decision made, they spent the following days in a flurry of activity that felt almost like preparing for war. Ezra gathered documentation of his medical practice, records of patients he'd treated over the years, testimonials from people he'd helped, evidence of his continued competence and dedication to healing. Sarah organized their defense from a different angle, writing letters to prominent citizens who might remember the diphtheria outbreak, researching territorial law regarding medical abandonment charges, and documenting the circumstances that had led to Ezra's exile. But their most important preparation was emotional. As they worked side by side, they spoke honestly about their fears and hopes, their past losses and future dreams. The artificial barriers that had once kept them carefully distant crumbled entirely, replaced by the kind of intimate partnership that Sarah had thought she'd lost forever when Thomas died. "I need to ask you something," Ezra said one evening, as they sat before the fire. The completed quilt spread across Sarah's lap like a prayer made manifest in fabric and thread. "Anything. If this goes badly, if I'm arrested or worse, what will you do?" "Where will you go?" Sarah considered the question seriously. With her cabin destroyed and no family to speak of, her options were limited. "I suppose I could rebuild on my old homestead or find work in Copper Falls. But Ezra, I'm not planning for a future without you in it." "You should," he said gently. "Just in case." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Sarah had intended. "I've spent 2 years living with ghosts and memories, building a life around loss and absence. I won't do that again. If we're going to face this thing, we face it with hope, not with plans for failure." "I don't want to cost you." "You haven't cost me anything," Sarah interrupted. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to love someone completely and be loved in return. Whatever happens with the law, that's not something anyone can take away. Even if I have to leave, even if circumstances force us apart. Even then." Sarah reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the casual intimacy that had become as natural as breathing. "Love doesn't disappear just because it becomes inconvenient or dangerous. It endures, like Anna's quilt," Ezra said softly, looking down at the completed pattern that lay across Sarah's knees. "Like Anna's quilt," Sarah agreed. "Beautiful things persist, even when the hands that made them are gone. Even when the original purpose changes or the intended recipient isn't there to appreciate them. What will you do with it?" "Now that it's finished," Sarah smoothed the fabric with gentle fingers, thinking of the woman who had started this project with such hope and care. "I thought I might give it to someone who needs something beautiful in their life. Someone who understands that love can take many forms and that finishing what others started is its own kind of devotion." "Sarah, I'm giving it to you, Ezra," she said quietly, "for your new life, whatever form it takes. So you remember that beautiful things can be completed, even after they've been interrupted by loss." Ezra was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she'd overstepped, offering a gift too weighted with significance for their uncertain circumstances. But when he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'll treasure it," he said simply. "Whatever happens, I'll treasure it and the hands that finished it." 3 days later, as the morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose, they heard the sound that would change everything, the distant jingle of harness and the voices of men calling to each other across the valley. "Riders," Ezra said, moving to the window to peer out at the trail that led up from Copper Falls. Sarah joined him, her heart hammering against her ribs as she counted the approaching figures. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. Too many to be casual travelers. The marshal?" "Probably." Ezra's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "It seems our letter reached its destination, or someone else told them where to find you," Sarah said grimly, thinking of the various people who had passed through the valley over the years, any one of whom might have recognized the famous Dr. Coleman and decided to collect the reward on his head. Either way, the time for hiding is over. Ezra turned from the window to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah looked around the cabin that had become home, at the chess set where she'd learned to play Anna's unfinished games, at the quilt that represented her own healing as much as its original creator's love, at the medical bag that had saved her life and so many others. This place had been a refuge, but it had also been a prison. Maybe it was time for both of them to step back into the world. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. "Then let's go meet our future," Ezra said, reaching for his coat and the letter that would either vindicate him or condemn him. As they stepped outside into the crisp mountain air, Sarah slipped her hand into Ezra's and felt him squeeze her fingers in return. Whatever was coming up that trail, they would face it together, with love as their armor and truth as their weapon. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Sarah found herself thinking of the pressed wildflower she'd seen in Ezra's medical journal, beauty preserved against all odds, enduring through the darkest seasons to bloom again when conditions were right. Perhaps that was what they were about to discover, whether love could bloom again after the longest winter of their lives. That the 5 riders who emerged from the tree line were not what Sarah had expected. Instead of a marshal's posse with drawn weapons and hostile intentions, she saw a mixed group of men in heavy traveling coats, their horses steaming in the cold air, their expressions more curious than threatening. The man in the lead was middle-aged and stocky, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors in all kinds of weather. He raised his hand in greeting as the group approached the cabin, and Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Dr. Coleman," the man called out, bringing his horse to a stop about 20 yards from where Sarah and Ezra stood. "Dr. Ezra Coleman?" "I'm Coleman," Ezra replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him, but his posture was straight and dignified, the bearing of a man prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. "Marshal Thomas Brennan." "Territorial authority," the lead rider said, dismounting with the careful movements of someone who had been in the saddle for long hours. "I believe you sent me a letter." "I did," Ezra confirmed, "along with documentation supporting my version of events from 15 years ago. Marshal Brennan nodded and gestured to his companions. "This is Deputy Marshal Hayes, Dr. Morrison from Copper Falls, Attorney Patterson." And he paused as the 5th rider dismounted, revealing a familiar face that made Sarah's heart skip. "Henrik Larson," Ezra said with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Keeping a promise," Henrik replied, moving carefully on his recently healed leg. "I told you I'd never forget what you did for my family. When word came down that they were finally going to settle the matter of Dr. Coleman's charges, I made sure I was here to speak on your behalf." Marshal Brennan stepped forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "Dr. Coleman, I'll be direct with you. The charges against you have been a source of controversy for 15 years. Some folks believe you abandoned your post during a critical time. Others maintain that you were made a scapegoat for losses that had nothing to do with your professional conduct." "And what do you believe, Marshal?" Sarah asked, stepping closer to Ezra's side. "I believe in evidence," Brennan replied, "and I believe in justice, even when it comes late." He reached into his coat and withdrew a thick folder. "Your letter prompted me to reopen the investigation into the diphtheria outbreak of 1872. What I found was illuminating." "What did you find?" Ezra's voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah could hear the hope he was trying to suppress. Dr. Morrison, a younger man with intelligent eyes, stepped forward. "May I explain, Marshal? As the current physician in Copper Falls, I've had access to medical records from that period." At Brennan's nod, Morrison continued. "Dr. Coleman, your treatment records from the outbreak show a mortality rate of less than 10%, remarkable for a diphtheria epidemic in 1872. Most physicians of that era lost 30 to 40% of their patients to the disease. The Henderson boy, Ezra began, died because the disease had progressed too far before you saw him," Morrison interrupted gently. "Your notes indicate he was already showing signs of airway obstruction when his family finally brought him in. No physician could have saved him at that stage." Sarah felt Ezra's hand tremble slightly in hers, but his voice remained steady. "What about the charges? The allegation that I abandoned my patients?" Attorney Patterson, a thin man with sharp eyes, consulted a legal document. The charges were filed by 3 families who lost children during the outbreak: the Hendersons, the Abbotts, and the Kellys. However, our investigation revealed that these families were pressured into filing by certain members of the town council who had their own reasons for wanting you discredited. What reasons? Sarah demanded. Political ones, Patterson replied grimly. Dr. Coleman had been advocating for improved sanitation in the mining camps, better working conditions for miners, and medical care for the territorial prison. Certain business interests found his influence inconvenient. Marshal Brennan took over the explanation. It appears that your departure, Dr. Coleman, was not the result of professional failure, but of a carefully orchestrated campaign to remove you from a position where you could continue to advocate for reforms that threatened certain profits. The families who filed the charges, Ezra said quietly. Did they know they were being manipulated? Some suspected. Henrik Larson spoke up. My father was friends with William Abbott. Before he died, Abbott admitted that he'd been pressured into signing the complaint against you. Said it was one of the things he regretted most in his life. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination crumble in Ezra's expression. So the charges are being officially dropped, Marshal Brennan announced. Moreover, the territorial government is prepared to offer Dr. Coleman a formal apology for the injustice he suffered, along with an offer to return to practice if he chooses. Return to practice? Ezra repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language. Dr. Morrison stepped forward eagerly. Copper Falls has been without a proper physician since old Dr. Henderson retired 3 years ago. The Territorial Medical Board has reviewed your qualifications and the circumstances of your departure. If you're willing, we'd like to offer you the position of Chief Medical Officer for the district. Sarah watched the interplay of emotions across Ezra's face. Shock, relief, hope, and something that might have been fear. This was everything he'd thought he'd lost forever, being offered back to him like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. Ezra stopped, looked at Sarah, then back at the assembled men. I need time to consider this. It's been 15 years since I practiced medicine in a formal capacity. Your skills haven't diminished, Henrik said firmly. You saved my life, and probably my family's. That's not something you forget how to do. There's more, Marshal Brennan said, his expression growing serious again. While the charges against you are being dropped, Dr. Coleman, there are other matters we need to discuss. Matters relating to your safety. Sarah felt her blood chill. What kind of matters? The men who orchestrated the original charges against Dr. Coleman, some of them are still alive, still influential, and still opposed to his return. We have reason to believe that certain parties might take unofficial action to prevent him from resuming his practice. You mean they might try to kill him? Sarah said bluntly. It's a possibility we have to consider, Brennan admitted. Which is why, if Dr. Coleman chooses to accept the position in Copper Falls, we're prepared to provide protection until the situation stabilizes. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his hand still clasped in Sarah's, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks where he'd spent 15 years in exile. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and measured. Gentlemen, I appreciate what you're offering more than I can express. To have my name cleared, to know that the charges were fabricated for political gain rather than based on professional failure, that lifts a weight I've carried for 15 years. But, Marshal Brennan prompted, sensing hesitation, but I'm no longer the same man who left Copper Falls in 1872, Ezra continued. I've lived differently up here, learned different things about what matters in life. If I return to practice, it won't be to resume my old life. It will be to build something new. What are you saying? Dr. Morrison asked. Ezra looked at Sarah, and she saw in his eyes the same determination that had carried her through 2 years of solitary hardship. I'm saying that if I accept your offer, it comes with conditions. And the first condition is that Sarah McKinnon becomes my wife and my partner in whatever new life we build together. Sarah felt her heart stop, then race as the words sank in. Ezra, I'm not asking you to answer now, he said quickly, turning to face her fully. But I'm not facing the future without you, Sarah. Whatever form that future takes, I want you beside me. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Another rider was coming up the trail, pushing his horse hard through the snow, his urgency evident in every line of his posture. "Marshal!" The new arrival called out as he reached them. "You need to know, there's a group of armed men heading this way. Maybe a dozen riders, coming up the back trail from the mining camps. They're not friendly, and they're not official." Marshal Brennan's expression hardened instantly. "How far behind you?" "Maybe an hour, maybe less. They're pushing their horses hard." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. The very people who had orchestrated Ezra's exile 15 years ago were coming to finish what they'd started. And this time, they wouldn't be content with simply driving him away. "We need to go," Brennan said urgently. "Now, Dr. Coleman, if you're coming with us, gather what you need quickly." But Ezra was already shaking his head, his expression calm but resolute. "No, I've spent 15 years running from these people. I won't run anymore." "Ezra, this isn't about pride," Sarah said urgently. "These men are coming to kill you. Then they'll have to do it in the open, in front of witnesses, instead of hiding behind false charges and political manipulation." Ezra's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the old military bearing in his posture, the resolve of a man who had found his line in the sand. "You can't fight a dozen men alone," Henrik protested. Ezra looked around at the assembled group. The marshal, the doctor, the lawyer, the man whose life he'd saved, and smiled grimly. "Who says I'm alone?" The hour that followed was a study in controlled urgency. Marshal Brennan, despite his obvious preference for evacuating Ezra to safety, quickly adapted to the reality that his principal witness had no intention of running. Instead, he set about organizing the defense of the cabin with the methodical efficiency of a man who had faced desperate situations before. "Dr. Coleman, I need to know what weapons you have available," Brennan said, as they moved inside to assess their resources. Ezra opened a wooden chest that Sarah had never seen him access before. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were a military-issue rifle, 2 pistols, and enough ammunition for a prolonged engagement. "I served as a field surgeon during the Indian Wars," he explained, noting Sarah's surprised expression. "In that capacity, you learn to be prepared for more than medical emergencies." "Good," Brennan said approvingly. "Deputy Hayes, what's our tactical situation?" Hayes, a lean man with sharp eyes, had been studying the cabin's position from the windows. "Defensible but not ideal. We're on high ground with good sight lines, but we're also surrounded by trees that could provide cover for attackers. If they're smart, they'll try to get men positioned on 3 sides before making their move." "How long do we have?" Dr. Morrison asked nervously. He was clearly a man more comfortable with medical emergencies than armed confrontations. "Hard to say," the messenger who had brought word of the approaching riders replied. "They were maybe 30 minutes behind me when I left them, but they were moving slower than I was. Call it 20 minutes, maybe 30. Sarah found herself thinking with crystalline clarity despite the circumstances. "Ezra, the barn. Is there a back way out?" "Through the root cellar, yes. Why?" "Because if they surround the cabin, we'll need an escape route. And because someone should be positioned to protect the animals. If this goes badly, we'll need the horses." Marshal Brennan looked at her with new respect. "You've thought about this before. Living alone in the mountains teaches you to consider all possibilities," Sarah replied. "The question is, who goes to the barn and who stays to defend the cabin?" "I'll take that position," Attorney Patterson said unexpectedly. Everyone turned to look at the thin, scholarly man who seemed least suited for armed conflict. "Before I became a lawyer, I spent 5 years as a territorial ranger. I know my way around a rifle, and I know how to stay hidden." "That leaves 5 of us here," Brennan calculated. "Dr. Coleman, Mrs. McKinnon, Miss McKinnon," Sarah corrected automatically, then caught Ezra's meaningful look. "For now, anyway." Despite the tension of the situation, she saw Ezra's mouth quirk upward at that. "Sarah should be in the safest position possible," he said firmly. "The hell I should," Sarah replied with equal firmness. "I can shoot as well as any man here and better than some. I'm not hiding while others fight for my future." "Our future," Ezra corrected softly. "Our future," Sarah agreed. Before anyone could argue further, Henrik Larsson cleared his throat. "If I may, I think I hear horses." They all went silent, listening intently. Sure enough, the sound of multiple horses moving through snow was audible from the direction of the main trail. But there was something wrong with the rhythm, something that made Marshal Brennan's expression sharpen with concern. "That's too many horses," he said grimly. "And they're spreading out." Professional approach. Through the window, Sarah could see movement in the tree line, dark shapes against the snow that resolved into armed men taking positions around the cabin. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, which suggested this was more than just a group of angry townspeople. "Mercenaries," Deputy Hayes said quietly, confirming Sarah's fears. "Whoever's behind this has hired professionals." A voice called out from the trees, amplified by the thin mountain air. "Dr. Ezra Coleman, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible, and we can settle this without unnecessary bloodshed." Marshal Brennan moved to the window but stayed behind cover. "This is Marshal Thomas Brennan, Territorial Authority. You're trespassing on federal land and threatening a civilian under my protection. Identify yourselves and state your business." "Our business is with the doctor, Marshal. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when armed men threaten people in my jurisdiction," Brennan called back. "Dr. Coleman is under territorial protection pending the resolution of legal matters. Any action against him will be considered an act of war against territorial authority." There was a pause, followed by what sounded like heated discussion among the hidden attackers. Then the voice called out again, this time with a harder edge. "The territorial government's protection doesn't extend to murderers and cowards, Marshal. Coleman abandoned his patients to die. He's got blood on his hands that no legal technicality can wash clean." Sarah felt Ezra flinch beside her, the old guilt rising despite everything they'd learned about the true circumstances of his exile. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Don't listen to them," she said quietly. "They're trying to make you doubt yourself, make you think you deserve what they're planning." "Sarah's right," Marshal Brennan said firmly. "Dr. Coleman, I need you to know that everything we discovered in our investigation will be made public, regardless of what happens here today. The truth will come out. The truth," the voice from the trees called mockingly, "is that Coleman got 11 families killed because he was too proud to admit he was in over his head. The truth is that good people died while he played at being a hero." 11 families, Dr. Morrison repeated in confusion. "But the records show that only one child died," Ezra said quietly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "They're lying about the numbers, trying to make the losses seem greater than they were." "Why would they do that?" Sarah asked. "Because they need to believe their own version of events," Ezra replied with sudden clarity. "If they admit that the outbreak wasn't my fault, then they have to face the fact that they destroyed an innocent man's life for political gain." Marshal Brennan nodded grimly. "And if they let you return to practice, you'll eventually uncover evidence of the corruption that led to your exile. They can't afford to let you live. So what do we do?" Henrik asked. Before anyone could answer, the decision was made for them. A shot rang out from the trees, followed immediately by the sound of splintering wood as a bullet struck the cabin wall near the window where Brennan stood. "So much for negotiation," the marshal said grimly, checking his rifle. "Gentlemen and lady, it appears we're in for a fight." Sarah felt something cold and determined settle in her chest as she moved to the window Ezra had assigned her, rifle in hand. These men had come to destroy the man she loved, to silence the truth that would clear his name and restore his life. They had underestimated both Ezra's courage and the people who stood with him. "Ezra," she said softly as gunfire began to echo across the valley. "Yes? When this is over, when we've survived this and cleared your name and built our new life together, remind me to tell you that I love you." Despite the bullets now flying in earnest, Ezra turned to meet her eyes. "I love you too, Sarah McKinnon. And we are going to survive this. Promise! Promise, Ezra said firmly, then raised his rifle and began to fight for their future. The battle that followed was fierce, but brief. The attackers had numbers and professional training, but the defenders had better position, superior motivation, and something the mercenaries lacked: the absolute certainty that they were fighting for justice rather than money. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke cleared, 6 of the attackers lay dead in the snow, 3 more were wounded and captured, and the rest had fled back down the mountain. On the defenders' side, only Deputy Hayes had suffered. Injury, a minor flesh wound that Dr. Morrison treated with supplies from Ezra's medical bag, but it was what they found on the captured men that truly vindicated Ezra's decision to stand and fight. In the pocket of the apparent leader was a letter bearing the seal of the Territorial Mining Consortium, payment authorization for removing the threat posed by Dr. Coleman's potential return to practice. "This is it," Marshal Brennan said with satisfaction as he examined the document. "This is the evidence we need to prosecute the people who really orchestrated your exile. With this and the testimony of the survivors, we can bring charges against the entire conspiracy." "It's over?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to believe it. "It's over," Ezra confirmed, pulling her into his arms despite the watching eyes of their companions. "Finally, after 15 years, it's over." As they stood together in the aftermath of the battle, Sarah noticed something glinting in the snow near the cabin's foundation. She bent to retrieve it and found herself holding Marshal Brennan's territorial badge. Knocked from his coat during the fighting, the brass star seemed to catch and hold the afternoon sunlight, its official weight representing not just law enforcement authority, but justice finally served. She held it out to Brennan, who pinned it back to his coat with a satisfied nod. "Justice may be slow," he said, "but it's thorough when it finally arrives." "What happens now?" Dr. Morrison asked. Sarah looked at Ezra, seeing in his face the same mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious hope that she felt in her own heart. "Now," she said softly, "we start building the future we almost lost." 1 year later, Sarah Coleman stood in the doorway of the new cabin she and Ezra had built together, watching the spring light dance across the valley where they'd chosen to make their permanent home. The structure was larger than either of their previous dwellings, designed to accommodate not just their own needs, but the steady stream of patients who made the journey up from Copper Falls to seek treatment from the doctor, who had become something of a legend in the territory. The foundation stones of their new home had been laid with deliberate care, each one selected and placed by their own hands as a symbol of the solid base they were building for their shared future. Unlike the hasty construction of survival shelters, this cabin was built for permanence, for the life they intended to live together for decades to come. "Mrs. Coleman," Ezra's voice called from inside, warm with the affection that still made her heart skip even after 6 months of marriage. "Your first patient of the day has arrived." Sarah smiled and turned back into the cabin, where a young mother sat holding a feverish child, while Ezra prepared his examining instruments with the same meticulous care she'd first observed during her own recovery. The scene had become familiar over the past year. Ezra's medical practice had grown to include families from 3 different settlements, all drawn by his reputation for both skill and compassion. "How is little Emma today, Mrs. Patterson?" Sarah asked, settling into her role as assistant and comfort giver, while Ezra focused on the medical aspects of care. "Better, I think," the mother replied, though worry still creased her brow. "The fever broke during the night, and she's been asking for food this morning." "That's an excellent sign," Ezra said as he gently examined the child. "The worst of the illness has passed. Continue with the willow bark tea for another 2 days, and make sure she gets plenty of rest and liquids." Sarah watched him work with the same sense of wonder she'd felt during their first winter together. The man who had been hiding from his calling for 15 years had embraced it again, with a passion that spoke to the depth of his healing, not just of others, but of himself. "No charge for this visit," Ezra told Mrs. Patterson as he walked her to the door. Emma's recovery is payment enough. Doctor, you can't keep treating people for free, the woman protested. You have your own household to support now. We have everything we need, Sarah interjected gently. And sometimes the best payment is seeing a child healthy and happy again. After Mrs. Patterson left with her recovered daughter, Sarah and Ezra stood together in the comfortable quiet of their home, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built. Ezra's medical books lined the shelves alongside Sarah's collection of domestic guides and the novels they read aloud to each other in the evenings. Anna's completed quilt hung on the wall like a benediction, its intricate pattern catching the light and reminding them daily that beautiful things could be finished even after they'd been interrupted by loss. Dr. Morrison sent word that the Territorial Medical Board wants to formalize your position, Sarah said, handing Ezra the letter that had arrived with the morning mail. They're offering you the title of Chief Medical Officer for the entire Northern District. Ezra read the letter with a slight frown. It would mean travel, administrative duties, less time for direct patient care, and more recognition, better resources for your work, and the ability to train other physicians in the territory, Sarah countered. You could do a lot of good with that kind of authority. We could do a lot of good, Ezra corrected. I don't practice medicine alone anymore, remember? You're as much a part of this as I am. Sarah felt the familiar warmth that came from being truly seen and valued by the man she loved. Over the past year, she'd discovered an aptitude for medical assistance that surprised them both. Her steady hands and calm presence during emergencies had made her an invaluable partner in Ezra's practice. What do you think we should do? She asked. Ezra set the letter aside and moved to the window that looked out over the valley where they'd first fought for their right to be together. I think we should accept on the condition that we can maintain this cabin as our home base. The territory needs medical care, but we need this place, the peace of it, the reminder of how far we've come. And the other news? Sarah asked, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. Ezra's expression softened with wonder and joy. The other news makes accepting the position even more important. Our child deserves to grow up in a world where good people use their skills to help others, where justice and compassion matter more than profit and politics. Sarah smiled at his mention of their child, the new life that had begun growing inside her just as they were learning to truly live again themselves. Do you think Anna would approve of us, of the life we're building? I think Anna understood that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, Ezra said thoughtfully. I think she'd be happy that her quilt has a place in a home filled with love and purpose. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, but it wasn't another patient. Instead, Marshal Brennan stood on their threshold, his hat in his hands and his expression serious but not unfriendly. Marshal, Ezra said with some surprise. What brings you up the mountain? Justice, finally, Brennan replied, accepting Sarah's invitation to come inside. The last of the conspirators from the mining consortium has been convicted. Thomas Whitmore, the man who orchestrated your exile, was sentenced yesterday to 15 years in the territorial prison. Sarah felt a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. It's truly over then? It's truly over, Brennan confirmed. The territorial government has also approved a formal commendation for Dr. Coleman's service, along with compensation for the years of exile he endured. Not that money can restore lost time, but it's an acknowledgement of the injustice done. Ezra was quiet for a moment, processing the news. 15 years, he said finally. The same amount of time I spent in exile. Poetic justice, some might call it, Brennan agreed. Though I suspect Mr. Whitmore will find prison considerably less comfortable than your mountain retreat. What about the families who filed the original charges? Sarah asked. The ones who were pressured into accusing Ezra? Most have already approached the territorial attorney's office asking to make public apologies, Brennan replied. They want their names cleared of any association with the conspiracy. Turns out a lot of people in Copper Falls have felt guilty about Dr. Coleman's exile for years. And the Henderson family? Ezra asked quietly. Brennan's expression grew gentle. Mrs. Henderson specifically asked me to tell you that she never believed you were responsible for her son's death. She said she knew you did everything humanly possible to save him, and she's sorry it took so long for the truth to come out. Sarah watched Ezra's face as 15 years of guilt finally, truly began to release its hold on him. The boy's death would always be a sorrow. That was the nature of being a healer, carrying the weight of every life you couldn't save alongside the joy of those you could. But it was no longer a source of shame or self-recrimination. "Thank you for bringing word personally," Ezra said, extending his hand to the marshal. "For everything you've done to see justice served. Just doing my job," Brennan replied, though his grip was warm and firm. "Though I have to say, it's not often I get to see a story end this well. Most of the cases I deal with don't have such satisfying conclusions." After the marshal left, Sarah and Ezra stood together in their doorway, watching him ride down the mountain trail that had once brought armed men seeking to destroy their happiness. Now it brought patience, friends, official recognition, and the promise of a future built on truth rather than lies. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, thinking of the territorial appointment, the growing family, the life that stretched ahead of them, filled with purpose and love. "I'm ready," Ezra said, pulling her close against his side. "For the first time in 15 years, I'm ready to embrace whatever comes next." As the afternoon sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and rose, Sarah thought about the photograph of Thomas that now sat beside their wedding portrait on the mantelpiece. Both images represented love, but they also represented the different seasons of a life that had learned to bloom again after the hardest winter. The foundation stones of their cabin caught the fading light, solid and permanent beneath their feet. Tomorrow would bring new patience, new challenges, new opportunities to use their skills in service of others. But tonight, it was enough to stand together in the doorway of the home they'd built, surrounded by the evidence of love's persistence and the promise of all the springs yet to come. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the most beautiful things in life were those that had been broken and carefully mended, stronger in the places where they'd been healed. Like quilts completed by hands, other than those that began them. Like hearts that learned to love again after loss. Like lives that found their way back to purpose after the longest exile. In the distance, a wolf howled, not the threatening sound they'd once feared, but the call of a creature singing its own song of survival and continuance. Sarah smiled and leaned into Ezra's warmth, listening to the mountain wind carry promises of new beginnings across the valley they would always call home.